Thank you all. It's fantastic to be here. Coming from a Texan, for a Texan to say that if I could live anywhere else, it would be Florida, that's quite a compliment. I might have to convince my wife that we need to retire outside of Texas in Florida. It's a great place to be. I love how everything comes together, how God has a way of bringing together very diverse elements into kind of a unified whole. And it's like that in the worship service this morning. The hymns that we sang, the anchor holds within the veil. That's actually part of Christ Hold Fast, our symbolism of the anchor there. And, of course, Christ alone. And just the fact that we sang His grace is sufficient. That's what Christ Hold Fast is all about. And that's what I strive to do in all of my writings, all of my teachings as well, is to point to the fact that His grace alone is sufficient, that Christ alone is sufficient, that we have everything that God desires for us to have in Him and in Him alone, and we have it in abundance. God is not stingy. He gives us His riches over and over again, and they never run out. So thanks be to Him for enriching us in our impoverishment, because in Him we truly are wealthy in grace beyond measure. So I'm going to talk to you this morning about something that has been at the center of my life, my teaching, for quite a while now. Although I think I fell in love with it for all the wrong reasons. I fell in love with the Old Testament years ago. I think I probably fell in love with the Old Testament when I was just a boy, because the stories that I remember from the Bible are all Old Testament stories. David and Goliath, and of course Noah and the ark, and Daniel and the lion's den. Those formed kind of part of my childhood mental image of what the scriptures were all about. And then when I went to college, I took Greek, I took Hebrew, and I didn't like Hebrew at all for some reason. But it gave me a new insight into the Old Testament. And then when I went to seminary later on, I had a professor that introduced me to a little bit more of the depths of the Old Testament. I actually did fall in love with Hebrew then, became later on a Hebrew professor. But all this time, I still had not yet fallen in love with the Old Testament for the right reasons. I was approaching it as I think many within the church approach the Old Testament. I think there's basically three different ways that we can kind of journey into the Old Testament. So three different images, and I was stuck with the first one. It's like you go to museums, right? Museums are interesting places. They satisfy a certain intellectual curiosity that we have. You can walk through the aisles, and you can read this, and you can look at this and analyze it. But you know what? I've never met a single person who visited a museum and called it a life-changing experience for them. I mean, it certainly is interesting. It satisfies a curiosity. It can be fascinating. But a museum is not a place that you stay. A museum is not a place that you go to every day. It's a place you go to on occasion, and it's enjoyable, and then you leave, and you're really not altered in any significant way. You've just kind of filled your head with a few facts, a little bit of trivia from the past. And I think very often we have a museum approach to the Old Testament. It's kind of cool to go into on occasion and see, wow, it's neat the way they lived back then. That's bizarre, some of the things they did back then. You know, we can kind of get into the minutia of their daily life and their culture and society and their history, and it can be intellectually satisfying. But it's not as if our museum journey into the Old Testament is somehow life-changing. It doesn't alter our fundamental understanding of who we are and who God is, and how He is toward us. So we can kind of walk through the hallways of the Old Testament and leave unchanged. And we go back to maybe the New Testament, where we feel more at home. That is one way of approaching the Old Testament. Now, I think it's pretty common within the church, but there is another way that is much more common. And this approach to the Old Testament is the spiritual Planet Fitness approach to the Old Testament. Now, I go to the gym, and one of the things that I've learned when you go to the gym is you don't go to the gym to receive. You go to the gym to give, right? You are there to give. Give as much as you can, right? No pain, no gain. So you are not there to receive anything. You are there to give, to sweat, to give it all that you've got, because you're there to get in shape, right? Yeah. That's the reason. You're not there just to kind of lollygag around and play on your phone. You're there to get in shape. And so you're going to be sweating. Your heart's going to be racing. You're going to be giving everything. And you might not know exactly what to do, right? Especially if you first go. So what do? Sometimes you hire a trainer, right? Hire a trainer. Or something that I like to look around at people, ooh, he's really buff. He must know what he's doing. So you watch him. Okay, maybe that's what I'm supposed to do. Have you done that, right? You emulate those who are around you. I don't know how I'm supposed to do that, but I just saw her doing it, and she looks like she's in really great shape, so that's what I'm going to do. Oh, that's the way you use that machine, all right? So you end up mimicking those around you in order that you might give more and become healthier and stronger, look better, all the things that you're going for when you go to a gym, right? That's what it's all about. And very often we have a Planet Fitness approach to the Old Testament. In fact, this is by far, the approach that is espoused in most churches when it comes to the Old Testament. So what you do is you read the Old Testament as a place where you receive instruction on how you are to be. This is the way that God desires you to be like David, or to be like Moses, or to be like Noah, or to be like, well, Tamar really wouldn't work, would she? To be like, Jezebel really wouldn't work either. But then you get to looking a little bit beyond the kind of the Sunday school approach to the Old Testament, and do you really want to be like David? Do you really want to be like Moses in every respect? Do you really want to be like Noah? I guarantee you that if you take a Planet Fitness approach to the Old Testament, if you begin to model your life after these biblical characters, if you see them as your heroes and your heroines that you really want to be like, you're not going to end up in church leadership. You're going to end up in jail. Because very often when we look at the lives of these biblical characters, we see the life of a train wreck. Making huge, catastrophic, life-changing mistakes that sends them down a path of destruction. So the Planet Fitness approach to the Old Testament is not going to work. It will ruin your life in more ways than one. Not only would it lead you to make bad decisions, but it puts upon you a burden that you cannot bear. Not only a burden that you cannot bear, but a burden that ultimately is going to load you down with guilt and with hopelessness and despair. Because the more that we strive to be like these others, the more we're going to fail, and the more we're going to really render their lives as something which their lives were not. They're not saints that we are to emulate. They are sinners that are just like we are. So if we're going to look at their lives, let's look at their lives as those who mirror our own. Oh, he did that? Well, I guess I have too. She did that? Well, I guess I've really done that too. Maybe not in action, but in my heart and my mind. So if we're going to delve into the lives of these Old Testament characters, let's delve into their lives as those that reflect our own weaknesses and our own failures. And beyond that, more importantly, the God who loves them, who rescues them from their brokenness, who continues to use them despite their soiled resume that they drag everywhere with them. So those are the two, the museum and the Planet Fitness, those are two ways to approach the Old Testament. But the third way, and this is when I fell in love with the Old Testament for the right reason, is when you see the Old Testament as the cradle of Christ. Just like the manger held Christ wrapped in swaddling cloths, so the Old Testament holds Christ. And he's wrapped up in the swaddling cloths of every narrative, every prophecy, every psalm, every proverb. From beginning to end, these scriptures are wrapped around him. And so we ask of every chapter, it doesn't matter if it's Genesis chapter 1 or Leviticus or Deuteronomy or Proverbs or Psalms or whatever it is, we ask of every chapter the same question. How in these words is Christ speaking of himself to us? And when we ask that question, we're going to get to the right answer. Now, if we begin by asking of every chapter, what does this chapter tell me to do? We're going to end up on the path of moralism, which always ends in either a pharisaical feeling of, I'm triumphant over everything, or a despairing feeling that I can't do anything right. But if we ask of these stories, what is this? How is Christ using this to talk to me, to reveal himself to me? Then we're going to get the right answer. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to be looking this morning at the life of Jacob, and then this evening we're going to be looking at the life of David. We're going to look at these two different characters from two different parts of the Bible, two different stories, and yet a story that is all the same because their stories are the stories of men who were simultaneously saints and sinners. Not saints part of the time, and sinners part of the time. But simultaneously, saints and sinners. Sometimes you read the Old Testament and you're like, one chapter describes him as a pretty good guy, and the next chapter describes him as just making this horrific, selfish mistake. How can this be? Well, it can be because that's kind of the same way that we are, right? I mean, part of the time, yeah, we're okay, and then the next thing you turn around and we're doing something that's stupid or that's destructive, or at least we're thinking about it. We might be plotting it, right? And that's why these stories, these narratives, are about us. A writer named Frederick Buechner once said that if we're going to read the stories of the Old Testament right, we have to read ourselves into these stories. So these are reflective of who we are. Your biography was written before you were ever born. Your biography was written in the narratives of the Old Testament because every individual in one way or another is reflective of who you are. We're not unique individuals. We are all in this together. Whatever you think your deepest, darkest, most horrendous sin might be, somebody else in the room has committed it too. Maybe if not indeed, they have in their heart and in their mind. That's where we all are. And that's the beauty of the Old Testament, is that it actually records these things. If I had written the Bible, it would have been a lot shorter because I'd have edited out a bunch of embarrassing material. But God didn't. He included it. I mean, you read some of these stories and you're like, oh my goodness, wow. God actually included that in the Bible? I thought we called it the Holy Bible. But it's right there in black and white. So, speaking of this, let's get into the story of Jacob and talk about him. We're going to focus primarily on something that happened a little bit later in his journey, in chapter 32, when he has a strange encounter on the banks of a river one evening. But let's get a little bit of background here about Jacob, so that we can appreciate better exactly what kind of guy we're talking about. So how would you describe Jacob? What do you remember about him? Pretty good guy? Jacob was basically a jerk, to be quite honest with you. Yeah, sometimes you can tell the personality of someone when they're extremely young. You can, especially your own children, if you're on them enough, you can see their personality emerging very early on. Well, Jacob's personality emerged when he was being born. He's a twin, and he was upset about the fact, if newborn infants can be upset, he was upset about the fact that he was not exiting the birth canal first. And so he reached out his tiny infant hand and he grabbed his brother Esau by the heel and he tried to pull him back into the womb so that he could be born first. And that's why his name is Yaakov in Hebrew, which means heel. It's not a very complimentary name, but that was his name. Yaakov, Jacob, heel. And that particular action defined who Jacob was the rest of his life. Jacob might have been the first American. Because Americans are always, what do we say about second place? Second place is last place. We're always trying to get ahead. That's the goal, right? You got to get ahead. You got to push yourself. I mean, if somebody's in front of you, push them aside or go around them or jump over, whatever you got to do to get ahead. That's what it's all about, right? And if you're not getting ahead, you're falling behind. And that affects your self-esteem. So you're not going to feel as good about yourself, right? You're not as worth as much as other people. If you're not successful, if you're not popular, if you're not this or that, that's the American mindset. And that's basically the mindset of Jacob. And Jacob was willing to go to any extreme necessary in order to get ahead. So it begins by trying to pull his brother back into the womb so that he could get out first. Well, why did he want to get out first? Well, in the longer perspective, you want to get out first because the firstborn inherits twice as much as the secondborn. So, of course he wants to be first. He gets the preeminence. So that's how he starts out. He starts out as one who is grabbing the heel of his brother in order to pull him back into the womb. And things don't get better as time goes on, if you remember as the story goes, right? His brother comes back from hunting after they've grown up, and Jacob's cooking some food, and Esau is famished. He claims he's about to die. And so Jacob says, well, here, brother, I'm concerned about you. Here's some food. Does he say that? No, he takes advantage of the opportunity. I'll feed you if you give me your birthright. Great brother, right? Great brother. He wasn't able to get his way when he was being born, so he's going to take advantage of this opportunity now to get his brother's birthright, and he gets it. But he isn't done yet, because when their father thinks he's about ready to die, he decides to bless his oldest son, Esau. And so what does Jacob do then? Yeah, he pretends to be his brother, right? He goes to his brother's closet, and he gets some of his brother's clothes on. But there's a problem because, of course, Jacob is smooth, and Esau is very hairy. So mom has an idea. Mom and son are in this together. Take some goat skins, put it over your neck, on your hands. And he lies. He lies explicitly to his father. He comes to his father for the blessing. Isaac's basically blind, so he can't see that it's Jacob. He assumes that it's Esau. And 2 or 3 times we have explicit lies told by Jacob to his father. His father even says, "Are you my son?" Or, "Who are you, my son?" He says, "I am Esau." And then his dad says, "How did you get the game so quickly?" And he invoked the Lord's name. "Oh, the Lord has provided it for me." So Jacob is willing to do anything necessary in order to acquire the birthright. So he gets it. He receives the blessing of the firstborn. And Esau, understandably, is ready to kill his brother. So we have the beginning of the next saga in Jacob's life, which we'll go through really quickly, just kind of provide the background here. So Jacob runs away. He's got to save himself. He runs away to a foreign land where his mom's from, and he stays there for 20 years. And what happens to him while he's there? Well, he marries 2 sisters. And because they weren't producing enough children, he married, well, he really didn't marry, but he took their servant girl. So he's got 4 women that he's making babies with. He's got a full bedroom. And pretty soon every other bedroom in his house is full as well, as children begin to be born. And one sister is competing against another sister. And this sister sees that this sister is having more babies, so she says, well, here, sleep with my maidservant so I can have those babies too. And at the same time, all of this baby making is going on. He's figuring out ways to increase the size of his flocks and his herds so he can get more from his father-in-law. It's all about getting ahead, right? If you read the story of Jacob is all about Jacob. All about Jacob. Jacob is all about Jacob. I mean, he is extremely focused upon himself, navel-gazing to the extreme. So after 20 years, he's got basically 2 wives and 2 co-wives. He's got 12 children. He's got numerous flocks and herds. And he has a desire to go back home. So he goes back home. And that's where we pick up the story in Genesis chapter 32. And this is where things get very interesting. It's as if God has been preparing Jacob for this night his whole life. Jacob has been all about Jacob. He's been all about getting ahead, getting what he wants by any means necessary. And here he is. He's coming back from 20 years of exile, now a rich man, now a married man, now a father. You know, it really seems as if things have turned out pretty well for Jacob. Well, he's about finally to meet his match. God has brought Jacob to the point to where he is now going to put himself face to face with Jacob. And they're going to have a night-long wrestling match that reveals something about Jacob that he hadn't realized yet. That reveals something about God that he hasn't realized yet. And that's going to reveal something to us about who God is and the backwards way in which God brings blessings into our lives. So I'm looking here at Genesis chapter 32, starting at about verse 22 or 23. So Jacob is by himself. He has sent his family across the river, and he is going to spend the night by himself on the banks of the Jabbok River. Now, one of the first things I want you to notice is that he was all alone. God said to Adam, it's not good for the man to be alone. And that's true. It's usually not good for us men to be alone. We need our wives. But there are times when the best thing that can happen to us is for us to be alone. Because it's only when we're alone that God can do his best work on us. Without children tugging at our sleeves, without our spouse to accompany us, without friends around us, when we are utterly alone, that is sometimes when God can confront us with the truths that we need to hear the most. When there's no distractions, when there's no escape plan, when it's just God and us, face to face. So God has brought Jacob to this point. Separated from all his servants, all his family, all his wives, and all his children, he is here alone. And he's also here at night. There is no light by which Jacob can now see. He's kind of in the shoes of his father, Isaac. His father was Isaac. His father was blind. He was darkened in his eyes when he gave the blessing to Jacob. And now here is Jacob. And Jacob is confronting this enemy that he doesn't know at first under cover of darkness. So Jacob is responding to an attack under the cover of darkness. It says, a man wrestled with him until daybreak. Well, first of all, we have to ask, who is this man? And what is he doing wrestling? And how in the world did they wrestle all night? Well, first of all, as we learn as the story goes on, this man is not a man. This man ends up being God himself, and not just God himself, but the Son of God himself. As happens very frequently in the Old Testament, the Son of God would come and would manifest himself to his people in various forms. He walked in Eden in the cool of the day with Adam and Eve. He appeared with two angels to have a meal with Abraham and Sarah before the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Later on, he would appear as a pillar of fire and a pillar of smoke to the Israelites. He appeared as an angel in the burning bush to Moses. So the beauty of this is that the Son of God has always desired to be in the presence of his people. Not just from Bethlehem afterward, but before Bethlehem. He's always wanted to be where his people are. He manifests himself. He appears to them as a human being very often. But never does he appear and do what he does with Jacob, except in this particular episode. This is the only time that God appears as a real flesh and blood person and wrestles with someone. Now, my son's a wrestler. And they have 2, 3, 4-minute rounds. And by the end of it, he is exhausted. They're both covered in sweat. They're both worn out. And they're teenagers. They have plenty of energy. This lasts all night. An all-night wrestling match between Jacob and God. Now, what in the world is going on here? Why would God wrestle with Jacob? Same reason he wrestles with us. God has a way of taking us in what we think is our strength and wrestling with us until we are at the moment of weakness. God has a way of taking us when we think that we have everything figured out and wrestling with us until we're pretty sure we don't have anything figured out. You been there? Yeah, over and over. He has a way of taking us when basically our lives seem to be going exactly the way that we want them to be, and then wrestling with us, and we're pretty sure that nothing has gone right for as long as we can remember. I've been there. I spent about 8 years there. So about 10 years ago, my life fell to pieces. And then those pieces fell to pieces. And then those pieces fell to pieces until there were no pieces left. Just kind of grains of something floating in the wind. Ash, yes. And that's where I was for a long time. God wrestled me down, and he beat me into smithereens, as he does Jacob here. Why does he do that? Well, he does it because that's just the way that God works. And there's no other way that would work with us. It's just like at creation. You go back to Genesis chapter 1. What did God make everything out of? Nothing. In the beginning was God, and besides God, nothing else existed. So God looks out upon nothing, and he says in Hebrew, Yehi or, let there be light. And there was light. Now, we can turn the lights off in this room and cover the windows, and I can stand here all day saying, Yehi or, Yehi or, Yehi or, and nothing's going to happen. I mean, I can think it, I can believe it. My words, you can hear them, but they don't do anything. I speak them, but they don't really accomplish what I desire. God's words are the opposite. There's this link between God's speech and God's doing. God's doing and God's speech. They're intermingled so that what God says happens. And what happens is a result of God's speech. These two are one and the same. So when God says, let there be something, that something is. When God says you're forgiven, it's not up to you to decide whether you're going to be forgiven or not. You are. When God says you're alive, you don't think, I don't know if I want to live. No, you're alive. It's as simple as that. There is no stopping the Word of God. It accomplishes that which it says. But for that to happen, God wants to reduce everything down to nothing first. God creates everything out of nothing. He recreates everything out of nothing. He's constantly recreating us out of nothing. And so our lives go through this constant cycle of being reduced from what we think is something. I mean, I am something else, to where I'm nothing, so that God actually has something to work with. The more that I think I'm something, the less God has to work with. And the more that I'm nothing, then he has everything to work with. Because that's God's primary material. That's what he uses. And that's why he wrestles Jacob. And that's why he wrestles us. That's why he attacks us. It feels like an attack, right? You're like, well, God's become my enemy. That's the way it feels. Do you think Jacob thought this was a friendly match? Oh, look, there's somebody I can wrestle with all night. No, he thought an enemy had attacked him. It's just like that in the Psalms. The Psalms over and over describe God as if he's become the enemy of Israel. That's the way it feels. That's not the way it is, but that's the way it feels. So Jacob wrestles with God. God wrestles with Jacob all night. And the same thing happens in our lives. He's reducing Jacob down. He's pulling him down in order that he might recreate Jacob. The same thing that he does for us, because that's the way that God works. He is a recreating God. Yes. So we have this knockdown, drag-out fight in which Jacob is manhandled by God, reduced down to where God wants him to be. But the greatest surprise is still coming. The greatest shock is still coming. So dawn is breaking. And God says, let me go, for the dawn is breaking. And Jacob says, I will not let you go unless you bless me. So he said to him, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. And Jacob means what? Heel, swindler, deceiver. Yeah, complimentary name. And he said, your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel. For you have striven with God and with men, and have prevailed. And have prevailed. And just let this sink in for a few minutes. So God has been God, right? This is God wrestling with Jacob. The most powerful being in the universe. And he's wrestling with a man. All night. There's nothing, absolutely nothing that Jacob could have done to win this fight on his own. And yet God wrestles with him, and then he wrestles with him, and he wrestles with him some more. And in the end, who wins? Jacob. That is shocking. You've wrestled with God and you won? And that's what his name means. Israel means the one who strives with God. But he doesn't just fight with God, he wins. Who would have expected that? It's possibly the most shocking verse in the whole scriptures. A man wrestles with God and God loses. Man wins. How is this even possible, and what does it mean? Well, it's possible because God made it possible. That's how it's possible. God made it possible. Well, what does it mean? Well, it means everything. It means absolutely everything. This one verse gives us a greater insight into who God is than maybe any other verse in the Old or New Testament. Because what it describes to us is a God who rejoices in nothing more than us winning by him losing.
Wow.
God rejoices for us to win, and he rejoices so much that he loses. Now, I hope your minds are racing ahead. You're going through Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, all the way through the Old Testament, and pretty soon you've leaped over into the New Testament, and you're in Matthew, and you're reading along, and you're getting to the end of Jesus' life, and it's Holy Week, and he's in Jerusalem, and he's been arrested, and he's been convicted by a monkey court, and he's been crucified, and what happens on the cross? He loses. So that we win. That's exactly the kind of God that we have. He is willing to be last to make us first. He becomes a servant of all in order that he might make us into kings and queens. He loses everything, including his own life, that we might gain everything in him. For the joy set before Christ, he endured the cross. What was the joy? Well, I'm looking at the joy. The joy is you. That's the joy. The joy The joy that Christ faced when he was looking at the cross was not the joy of nails in his hands and feet and a crown of thorns on his head. There's no joy in that. The joy was the fact that when he endured this, he knew that you would become his own, that your sins would be forgiven, that you would now be adopted into the family of God. And so that's why it was a joy for him, in order that he might gain you. He was willing to lose everything. Now, if that doesn't tell you what kind of God we have, I don't know what will. And show me a God in any other religion that does that. A God that was willing to give up everything, to be bested by humanity, to be crucified, put to death, in order that he might gain you. That's the kind of God that we have. So what we see in the story of Jacob is a foreshadowing of Good Friday. It's the story of a God who wrestles with humanity that could easily have won. It's a snap of his fingers, but he doesn't. They wrestle all night, and in the end, he crowns Jacob with a new name, a new identity, which is what a name brings, right? If I change my name, I'm changing my identity. Especially in the Old Testament, names are an integral part of who you are. So yeah, if your name is changed, your identity's been changed. So as of this moment, when God lets Jacob win and bestows upon him a new name, Jacob has a new identity. He's the God fighter. He's the one who fights God and wins in order that God might win in his own losing, because God wins when we receive his blessings. And the only way that we receive his blessings is by God giving them. And God gives us his blessings by giving up his own life in order that we might be enriched by the gifts that he gives to us. It's an incredible view of who God is. We tend to think of God, if people do think of God at all, they think of him as sort of either he's somebody in the skies way far away that really doesn't care too much about us, or maybe he's a dictatorial, all-powerful tyrant in some places, even in some Christian churches. But this is a picture of God that is totally unlike any of that. This is a picture of the God who comes down, wrestles with humanity, is pinned to a cross, and rejoices to die in order that in that death he might make us alive. This is the love of God. This is how the love of God is manifested to us. And it's us. We get the new names. Yes. We are called now Christian. Those who are of Christ. Those who are now part of his body. So that our complete identity has been changed. We are no longer who we were before. Paul says it this way. He says, I've been crucified with Christ. It's no longer I who live, but it's Christ who lives in me. It's an amazing confession. I have died with Christ. I have not like, I've sort of like passed away with him. No, I've been nailed to the cross with him. It's no longer I who live, but it's Christ who lives in me. My whole identity is wrapped up in him because he has made me part of himself. He has baptized me into himself. He's taken me into his own identity so that when the Father sees me, he sees me as his child in Christ. If you could see through the eyes of God how he sees you, you wouldn't recognize yourself because you'd look just like Jesus. That's the way that he sees us. Because what Christ does for us is he strips away our filthy garments of our own goodness, which is not that good. He takes away our filthy garments of righteousness, and then he cleans us from head to toe with his baptismal water, with his sacrificial blood, and then he doesn't leave us naked like Adam and Eve were in the garden. No, we receive more in Christ than we lost in Adam. Because we are now clothed with the righteousness of Christ, so that we are called children of God, and we call God Abba, Father. That's who our identity is. That's our new name. And this happens as a result of God wrestling with us and letting us win. So you've fought with God and with man and have prevailed. He fought against God and he let you win. He became the servant in order that you might become kings and queens in his kingdom. Now there's an interesting side note, and I'm going to wrap up with this at the end of this. Jacob says he's seen God face to face, and as the sun begins to rise, he limps away on his thigh. Because what God did is he dislocated his hip at one point. And it says at the very end of that chapter, to this day the sons of Israel do not eat the sinew of the hip, which is on the socket of the thigh, because he touched the socket of Jacob's thigh in the sinew of the hip. And we're like, okay, whatever. But no, there's something hidden here. The Israelites to that day did not eat that part of the animal, because that remained for them a reminder of how God put a wound upon Jacob when he blessed him. It was like a scar. It was like a memento to the Israelites. And I think very, very often in our culture, we're told to forget our scars, to forget our pains, to bury it, not to think about it. You know, the new sin has become keeping your scars, right? That's the new cultural sin, because we're supposed to be perfect, flawless. But God calls us to treasure our scars because they are a reminder of how he has wounded us in order to heal us, killed us in order to make us alive, buried us in order to resurrect us. That's the way that our God works. So be a good steward of your scars, because your scars are the mementos of God's grace and favor towards you. They're not an embarrassment. Instead, they're an acknowledgement that God loves you, that yes, he wounds, but in order to heal. He kills, but in order to make alive. It's just like the scars remain in the hands and in the side and in the feet of Christ as emblems of his love for us, so our own scars are joined to Christ's scars as emblems of his mercy and his love toward us. Thanks be to God. Amen.